Well, thanks for coming. Thanks for hanging in there. We all know that the very best presentations are saved for the end. It's also your last impression. You never get a second chance, whatever that is. But thanks for coming. I've been interested, I've always been interested in sports cars, right? And I've professionally always been involved with documentation of cultural heritage. And I met Casey Maxon, who's on the far end, about a year and a half ago. And we started talking about how he is documenting automobiles for a different purpose than is usually done. And that is to document automobiles as objects of cultural heritage, for their impact on the culture, not just for their coolness, not just for their speed, but as serious objects of cultural heritage. And I thought this would be an interesting topic because I was not aware of anyone else who's doing that. The Smithsonian has a significant collection of about 200 automobiles, but as far as I'm aware, and I'd love to hear otherwise, there's not very much activity around sharing that collection, photographing it, documenting those vehicles. My understanding is that it's just severely underfunded, right? But Casey and Jarob have been involved in an endeavor that's maybe a year and a half old, or maybe 2 years old, called the National Historic Vehicle Register. And the purpose of that is to identify automobiles that are significant in America's cultural history, document them thoroughly, and we'll talk a little bit about what that really means. What do you document? Someone at lunch said, well, maybe it's important to document the sound of that automobile. Hadn't occurred to me. I mean, decisions have to be made about what to document, right? So they've been working very, very methodically on determining that. They're working, so Casey is working in conjunction with Jarob, who's at the National Park Service. And together, the record that they create is being archived by Library of Congress. So what they create will be archived in perpetuity. So there's also a third person on the panel who was unable to be here. He was double booked. And his name is Thomas Behrens. And I'll introduce each of the speakers, maybe have a follow-up comment or not, but we'll save all the questions for the end, okay? And I hope you can hang in there that long. So our first presenter in absentia is Thomas Behrens. Okay. So Thomas is an architect by training, and by that I mean a traditional, not an information architect, he's an architect. He studies and creates built environment. But he's an architect with the Historic American Engineering Record, which is administered by the National Park Service. He's been in that position since 1998, and his current responsibilities include documentation of large, complex architectural sites, for which he utilizes high-definition laser scanning as a tool to conduct field surveys, to produce measured and interpretive drawings. And his technology is being applied to capturing descriptive data about automobiles. So I'm going to play, Tom was kind enough to record a voiceover for his presentation. So I'm going to do that right now. It should pop up. And this is about an 8-minute presentation. I think I need this. But you can't hear it.
Not able to be there with you. I overbooked today and traveling to Pittsburgh. Could not work with my other commitments. Thank you, Eric, for inviting me to be part of the heavy metal discussion channel. My name is Tom Behrens. I am with the Historic American Engineering Record, part of the Heritage Documentation Programs of the National Park Service. I will have a QR code at the end of my presentation to use to find more information on the HARE program. For this presentation, it is sufficient to say that the Heritage Documentation Programs produce archivally stable documentation, develops and maintains documentation standards, and produces guidelines for others to create documentation which can be included in the nation's largest archive of historic architectural, engineering, and landscape documentation. This documentation consists of measured and interpretive drawings, large format photographs, and written historical reports. They are housed and maintained at the Library of Congress and made available to the public copyright-free through the library's website or in person at the library's Prints and Photographs Division. For the past few years, the Historic Vehicles Association has partnered with the Historic American Engineering Record to produce documentation of historically significant vehicles for inclusion in our collection. This documentation is often done in conjunction with the vehicle being included on their historic vehicle registry. I'll be using the documentation of the 1911 Marmon Wasp, the winner of the first Indianapolis 500 race, to illustrate a number of points of discussion. The heritage documentation programs have been using high-definition laser scanning as part of the field documentation process for more than 10 years. The use of laser scanners to collect accurate dimensional data from one-of-a-kind, often irreplaceable artifacts, in this case vehicles, is critical because it keeps physical contact with the resources to a minimum. It also enables us to collect complex three-dimensional data that would be nearly impossible to obtain using traditional methods. Additionally, data acquisition from the laser scanners is a fairly quick process. Depending on the size and complexity of the vehicle being documented, scanning can be completed in about a day and sometimes less. This has proved to be important to us as access time to many of the vehicles is limited. There are a number of scanning systems and technologies on the market today. They are all slightly different, have their own strengths and weaknesses, but operate on the same principles. High-definition laser scans produce three-dimensional clouds of points from where the scanner senses when its laser beam hits an object, and the angle and distance of that point is recorded. This process is repeated thousands of times a second through a sweep angle or range defined by the user. The system that we have been using to document vehicles for HVA employs a control network, independent of the object being scanned, as reference points for the scanner as it is moved to different scanning positions around the vehicle to capture a complete resource from multiple angles. These positions are registered together using the control network and creates a complete three-dimensional cloud. This system can also collect photographic data from which color data can be mapped onto the point cloud to add a degree of realism to the 3D display. This still photo is a screen capture of point cloud data after it has been registered together and cleaned up using software to process the data from the scanner. You can manipulate the point cloud and orbit in any direction and zoom in to focus on any area of interest. Because of our specific workflow and deliverables at the engineering record, we orient the point cloud data to create orthographic projections, and from those projections, create accurate line drawings. This image is a collage intended to illustrate the different orientations of a point cloud needed to produce our drawings. This is an example of a sheet of measured drawings that will be submitted to the Library of Congress. Incidentally, this image's background and foreground colors have been inverted for easier viewing. The finished products are black line work on a white background. Given our unique requirement of producing archivally stable documents, the orthographic line drawings are what drives our scanning process. Understanding the purpose we are driving for before we begin scanning ultimately informs us on how to proceed on any given project. At this point, I would like to explain that although our official documentation does not include the digital point cloud data, we are retaining all of that data from all of our projects, which will ultimately be sent to the National Archives for storage and preservation. Regardless of the scanning system, if care is not taken, the closer you look at a point cloud, though it may initially look robust, the more you can uncover incomplete or missing data. In order to limit the possibility of missing or incomplete data, developing a consistent workflow with the scanning equipment, keeping track of progress, and careful note-taking on the scanning process will help ensure getting the best possible data. This image is a quick plan sketch of the car and the space we were working in order to map out the target placements for the control network and our scanning positions around the Marmon Wasp. This is an example of the chart we use in keeping track of the scanner positions and the control targets acquired for the positions keyed to the previous sketch, what type of targets they were, the resolution or density of the scan, whether we are using internal or external photographic data, and any additional comments about unusual conditions or occurrences that were encountered. These notes help reconstruct the scanning process when you're weeks and months past your time in the field and are vital in the processing of scan data. It is also preferable to have the team that is scanning in the field also be the team that will be working with the data. As mentioned earlier, this still image is data that underwent post-processing. The point cloud is now ready to be imported into CAD software to begin the process of orthographic line drawing. The process of creating line drawings is where the more challenging work begins. During this process, the quality and completeness of the data begins to show, and the weakness of any particular scanning system begins to show. The point cloud is rotated and sliced into segments that are related to the view being worked on. Large forms and profiles are established and plotted, and working in small sections, intermediate forms and details are located and drawn. Often, even with densely packed points, fine details can get obscured in the mass of acquired data. I consider the scan data of the Marmon Wasp excellent data. Even so, there are some areas, colors, textures, and details that the scanner did not capture well. This is a close-up view of the Wasp's point cloud data showing the front suspension and wheel assembly. We have good strong data on the yellow parts, but the black painted suspension components are beginning to drop out, leaving incomplete details. Using what I could discern from the point cloud and information from numerous photographs of the suspension parts, I was able to sketch out details of the various parts and their interrelationships. This in turn helped me flesh out the suspension components that were a bit obscure in the point cloud. This is a screenshot of the suspension from our CAD program. The different colored lines represent what will be different line thicknesses in the printed version. Laser scanning should not replace close observation. Taking field notes and taking copious amounts of reference photographs will confirm and enhance the data derived from the scanner to create an accurate reflection of the resource. Scanning technologies have enabled us to apply our expertise in documenting historic engineering resources to the documentation of historic vehicles in a manner that is efficient and effective, although it is not a quick and easy solution as some may tout. And data acquisition should not be confused with documentation. It is merely one step in the process of creating a complete record. High-definition laser scanning has provided an excellent solution to the vexing problem of how to produce measured drawings of historic vehicles. Thank you all for your attention, and I hope I gave you a few insights into how we are applying technology and our expertise to document some amazing vehicles. I want to again thank Erik Landsberg and the MCN conference organizers for inviting me to participate in the panel discussion. If you have any questions or need clarifications, you are welcome to email me at thomas_behrens@nps.gov. Get your smartphones out. As promised, here is the QR code for a PDF with more information about the HARE program.
Okay. Well, even though he's not here to thank, I thank Tom for taking the time to do that voiceover. in spite of being double booked. So although Tom will not be here to answer questions, obviously Jarob and Casey can cover a lot of, if you have any questions about that process, which is maybe the most deeply technical process we're going to talk about, they can very likely cover for that. So my next speaker is Jarob Ortiz. Jarob is the staff photographer in the heritage documentation programs of the National Park Service. Among his many current responsibilities is updating the standards and guidelines for digital imaging within the heritage documentation programs, including the Historic American Engineering Record. So welcome, Jarob. Just press that when you need to go forward.
Okay, sounds great. I'm Jarob Ortiz. I am the large format staff photographer for the heritage documentation programs. That program consists of 3 sub-programs, which is the Historic American Building Survey, the Historic American Engineering Record, and the Historic American Landscape Survey, which is basically, like you just heard, a documentation of our nation's culture, basically for everyone, the public. So basically our collection is the largest collection of heritage documentation. It was first administered in 1933, and I believe it's the longest running program in the U.S. government. Consists of over 500,000 measured drawings, large format photographs, and written histories. And with that said, that's the important thing to know about this collection, is that not any one element of this collection can exist without the other. They all supplement one another, where the drawings and the 3D modelings come short. The photographs and the history will basically fill in those gaps, and everything, even within that, where the histories come up short, you can reference the other things. They go back. Oops. The documentation serves as a permanent record, and it is available copyright free for everyone to access. And it's kind of funny, you can do whatever you want with these things. I've seen them for sale on eBay. People just download this stuff and sell them. But what's funny is that in the recent years, or traditionally this was used by professionals, this collection, to get insight into certain historic structures. But recently now, with the digitization of this collection, it is now being used more for educational purposes, more specifically at the elementary level, which I think is a really interesting transition that's happening with this collection. Everything can be viewed on the Library of Congress's website, and that is the website right there, the link to it, should you want to go and explore. Everything is keyworded and pretty easy to find if it's in there, if you know some sort of reference for what it is that you're trying to find. And I encourage you to look into that. So, as it stands right now, we are still doing an analog collection. We have not switched to digital yet. And for those that are not familiar, we are using large format photography. And the reason why we do this is because it allows us to basically render subject matter in a way that we see it with our eyes, perspective correct, instead of converging lines. Up until recently, this provided the best high resolution capture, which means that we were able to extract more information from these images than we were with digital formats. But the most important thing was that this was a stable material that we could archive. We knew how to approach it. You have a hard record. The negative served as that hard record, which then we could store, and we knew we had it, and it would last for a long period of time and always be referenced. And where it fits into the process is that they basically, the photographs act as the visual reference for everybody looking at this documentation, the way that we would see it. I mean, the drawings, personally, I think the drawings are the most important thing because you're getting hard measurements on it. You see what you get, basically, if you needed to reconstruct something, you could do it from the drawings. But with that said, you still need the visual context of the way that something looked. Also, with the photographs, we typically use these scale sticks, as you see here. So in elements where maybe there wasn't a lot of attention made to certain mechanical features or whatnot, we can provide that through the photographs with these scale sticks. And here, this is an example here where this is the drawing that Tom created before, but as you can see, to the untrained eye, that might be a little bit confusing. Whereas, like I said, for an elementary class, you can look at basically the same kind of equipment here in a photograph, and that makes a little bit more sense. These are from two different projects, but we did not have the photographs for the WASP drawing, so I used one of Casey's photographs from a different project to kind of just give a reference of how they fit together. But last week we did begin this conversation about making the transition to digital photography because it is time. To be like pretty straightforward about it, analog photography is going away pretty quick, and more specifically, our ability to do color photography. Right now, we're still using the E6 process, and that's the only process that's accepted by the Library of Congress. Right now, we are down to one manufacturer of E6 film and one manufacturer of E6 chemistry. I don't think it's going to be too long before there are none of those. And I think more importantly, with the digital process, E6 and the way that film reacts to certain color casts and everything, it's really hard to get a color accurate image. And that's completely different with digital photography. This thing keeps going. It keeps going by itself.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's all good. That's really the big pitch that I've given to the National Park Service here. One, that we are going to lose our ability to do color photography, and two, how much easier it is for us to get a color accurate photograph, and that it is something that can be measured and be proven to be accurate through the use of color checking devices. And I think that's a huge, huge, huge bonus. Also, the other thing is that I think that this is going to seriously increase our production, like the amount that we're able to document. Right now, it's taking me, because of the limited latitude of film, it takes me about an hour and a half to 2 hours to set up one photograph and do it. Then that film has to be processed when I get back to Washington, D.C., then it has to be scanned, and then it has to be prepared for print and presentation. It's a long process, whereas with digital, I'll be able to shoot it and then go back to my hotel room and finish it that night. I think we will be able to do a lot more, and we need to be doing a lot more because there are a lot of structures and historic, culturally relevant things that we are missing out on. Just this last year, the Sperry Chalet up in the Glacier National Park burned to the ground, and there was no documentation done of this structure, and now everyone's scrambling to find anything they can to rebuild it. And this is happening all over the place, even out with what happened to the vineyards in California. We were actually working on doing the documentation out there in the coming years, but we are a day late and a dollar short on that. And I think that doing this, not only will we at the DC office be able to do it, but we're going to be able to open this up to more people. I mean, quite frankly, the number of people doing large format photography these days is dwindling quick. And now when we do this, there will be more people that are able to do this kind of documentation. And I think that's really, really important. And it's also going to allow for us to bring in more ideas. And we're looking forward to working with a lot of institutions and hearing their ideas for the approach to our collection. And also now that the Library of Congress has had time, because of the length of time that digital photography has been out there, they have had ample time to address digital photography in the way that they are going to archive it and back it up. And that was really a key part of this whole transition, was waiting until they said they were comfortable. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Casey, which is with the Historic Vehicle Association. He has actually provided the first digital collection digital projects for our collection, and has really been, I guess, the guinea pig as to what works and what doesn't. And yeah, Casey.
Thanks, Jarob. Thanks a lot. And just before Casey speaks, let me explain that Casey is an automotive historian and a photographer, like the perfect guy to be doing this job, right? He's with the Historic Vehicle Association. He manages the organization's National Historic Vehicle Register to preserve the history and promote the study of the automobile and its impact on culture in the United States. So I'm looking forward to hearing Casey.
Good afternoon, guys. Thanks for hanging around with us. Let me just give you a little bit of background here. So it was really about 4 years ago, we founded what is called the National Historic Vehicle Register. We're a small group of about 5 people. We recognize that automobiles are, as you guys probably understand, an important part of our cultural heritage. And as far as programs within the federal government and even some of our academic communities, they've been kind of ignored, I guess you could say. I mean, we have a number of fantastic museums across the country that have wonderful automobile collections, but if you look at the study of cultural heritage and documentation, there's not been much devoted to automobiles. And so we looked at, okay, what could we do? What programs exist? How could we fit in? And we saw the effects of the National Register of Historic Places and its benefit to the community, as well as the documentation programs, Historic American Engineering Record, Historic American Building Survey, and Historic American Landscape Survey. The National Register of Historic Places, when the National Historic Preservation Act was passed in 1966, it actually included automobiles. That is in the language of the legislation. However, the National Register of Historic Places is a kind of a massive organization that depends on state historic preservation offices. And when we approached them, they said, no way are we going to open the doors to automobiles. It's too much bureaucratic legwork. It's just not happening. And we said, okay, well, we're just going to go at it on our own. We started looking at the heritage documentation programs, and we said, okay, you know, there's Secretary of Interior standards on documentation. We want to continue pursuing this. And with the idea that, look, we want to curate a record of our automotive past, because our mission at the end of the day is to make sure that we promote automotive heritage. We share America's automotive heritage with the American people. And how best can we do that? Well, if we have specific examples of how the automobiles have impacted the country, and then we create and preserve this record of the automobiles, people will start to understand specific stories. And so We also wanted to make sure, though, that, okay, so we have President Taft's limousine, the first ever presidential limousine, the first ever vehicle purchased by the federal government to escort the highest elected official around. We need to make sure we preserve the record, because while you think that, oh yeah, it's obvious, that car is going to be saved indefinitely, it might not. The car actually had about a 60-year gap in its history where nobody knows where the car was. We want to make sure that the story, the record, as detailed as possible, is collected and saved for generations and generations to come. So we're still a little bit new, getting this collection put together. But we kind of have 4 parts for our own collection, which eventually will be on our website, available to the public. Right now, if you go to our website, it's kind of, there's not much on there yet. We've been kind of collecting up our data with the idea that it's going to the Library of Congress. We've still got a lot of work to do. You're kind of looking at the only guy that's doing it. So it's kind of a bit of a bottleneck, but there's 4 parts. We have the written histories, we have the photography, the laser scans, and then the part that doesn't go to the Library of Congress is we produce a small documentary film on each car. If you go on our YouTube page, you can find all sorts. And we think, back to documenting the sound, documenting the stories of the individuals that built these cars, that drove these cars, it is crucial. And having those first-person interviews, it helps inform our written histories, but also being able to present the person that built the car to the world. Recording that film helps a lot too. So here are just a couple screen caps. I have President Taft's limousine that we laser scan. That's the first Camaro. And then over on the far right is probably one of the most significant hot rods built, a modified car, started out as a 1932 Ford. And that's us doing our documentary film on the car. So, breaking down, I'm here to talk about the photography primarily. So obviously an extremely important part of the 4 sets of documentation, kind of break it down into 3 sections. I'm mainly going to talk about image capture, a little bit basic, but I wanted to get into that. So image capture, what do we do? How do we do this? And how could maybe a museum that has an automobile collection take some of these practices and apply them? Eventually with Jarob and the National Park Service, we want to put out and publish guidelines, best practices for doing automobiles, because while I'm doing all this work now, we want to make this program available to the public so we can start documenting hundreds, if not thousands, of automobiles, as long as they meet the significance requirements and the documentation is up to snuff. But a lot of this had been kind of on the back burner with publishing digital standards. So we, the program was based in large format film, and we kind of came at this and said, look, guys, in the automobile world, there's basically nobody doing large format film photography anymore. We want to push this out to the public. If we made that the requirement, it's just not going to happen. And we started looking at maybe kind of a workaround, cheating the system a little bit. Sorry, Jarob. And I found, I started working with a group called Chicago Albumin Works in Massachusetts, and they were able to take digital images, convert them to large format 4x5 negatives, and I submitted those, and the Library of Congress reviewed it and said, yeah, that works. We'll do that. I kind of got around the issue of using perspective correction because I'm photographing automobiles where I'm not necessarily looking up. I worked on some standards around how we could make sure that we're documenting the cars in as accurate as a manner as possible. And basically what we came to eventually is 50 megapixel or higher, just so there's some sort of threshold for resolution. I've worked with another photographer, Joseph Elliott, who actually did some comparisons of large format, that gave us some basis for doing this. And, perspective correction when needed. It also helps for doing interior shots of macro or, close-up objects where you want to try and get your depth of field in the right aspect. Obviously using nice lenses, that sort of thing. Color calibrated monitor, we shoot tethered. Color targets, scale sticks, as color consistent lighting as possible. Obviously on a nice tripod or camera stand. Basic stuff. So documenting the vehicles as accurately as possible, making sure we're not interpreting the way we think the car should look. We're doing it based on how the car actually, it is, or as close as we think you might be visually seeing the car. So, just some basic notes on camera setting, native ISO, manual mode. So this is all the digital stuff that we've been working on, shooting raw, so that as little conversion is taking place in the camera as possible. Custom white balances just to get your colors at least close to begin with. All the onboard adjustments off, shutter lockup. Again, sharp images, accurate images to represent the automobile. So how have we been doing this? So we actually started this out photographing on site, on location, with the idea that this was a HARE project, Historic American Engineering Record project, that anybody could do. And we thought right away that we were going to open this up to the public and realize the difficulty in that. But we started out photographing on location as rudimentary as we could, basically with the idea that anybody could pick this up, that we could send this off to a museum. There are car collectors all over the country that have significant automobiles. How do we make this a program that just about, not anybody, but somebody with enough savviness could figure out and follow some sort of guidelines? After we started going after it for a while, we realized, look, nobody's documenting these cars. The museums that have the cars, they haven't ever really photographed them very accurately. We wanted to take it to the next level. We built a studio complex in Allentown, Pennsylvania, with the help of a benefactor. That studio space, 40 by 40, cyclorama, all 4-6 sides. And then we bring lights in basically to create a very diffuse lighting, takes out all distraction, all weird reflections from the cars. And then we get way back. We get 50, 60 feet away with medium telephoto lens. We've compared those images of the cars to orthographic line drawings we've produced to create the most visually undistorted images we can to make sure that, again, the car is what you think it is, what it actually looks like in person. Because while we know what a 1967 Camaro looks like, we might know what a 1909 white steam car looks like. People 50, 100, 200 years from now do not. My grandchildren's grandchildren may never, ever see a 1967 Camaro. I would like them to have public access to a record in the Library of Congress that shows them as accurate of a photo as possible of what that Camaro looks like, so that they will have that record, and that record will live on forever. And so that's why we've gone to great lengths to make sure that we have as accurate of photos as possible, camera on the levels, and then we actually have a turntable in the middle of the cyclorama room that's automated to my computer. So I can spin the car 45 degrees, and that way the front 3/4 matches the rear 3/4, the camera never moves, and I'm central to the central axis of the car so that you understand the angles as consistently as possible. And then every car I bring through there is done the exact same way, so that when this record, 50 years from now, the images will be very similar. You can compare a 1967 Camaro with a 1967 Mustang, and you can see those two cars next to each other and see how much Ford was taking from Chevy and Chevy was taking from Ford, that sort of thing. And again, having this consistent, accurate record that's easy for people to understand long into the future. Lighting, again, right there is this was one of our early setups that's not a very good representation of what we do. We use strobes, bounced off the walls. It's not perfect. So this is the continual battle. In this photo, you see I have a nice, beautiful overhead softbox, which is great, and actually where we started out when we were building the space. There's a number of issues with this. One being cost, but also when you have that massive softbox over a real shiny car, the car ends up becoming a giant mirror. You end up with a massive highlight across the top and a beautiful, nice, contrasty shadow towards the bottom of the car. You can throw some fill light in, but no matter what, you end up with this massive highlight on top of the car. It changes your understanding of how the car looks. Also, every time the car moves, you have to move the softbox to match the car's direction. There are a number of issues with putting that into our space. So we thought, okay, what will create diffuse, even lighting if we just turn the whole thing into this massive just wash of light. There are other issues that we've encountered since then. We're still working through this, but we have created some very nice, even light, evenly lit vehicles so we can document and understand exactly what they are. So I've kind of split this into two sections. So we do profile images, which help give, the viewer, the researcher, as much of an understanding as you can from the overall image. Here's that hot rod again. And real quick, this is a 1896 Benton Harbor, built in Benton Harbor, Michigan. Probably one of the first automobiles built in the state of Michigan. It still could run today. It was a one and done sort of thing. A group called the Bauschke brothers built it for one of the first automobile races in the world in Chicago. They didn't finish it. They, after building it, they ran it once. It failed, and they said, they're famously quoted in the local newspapers saying, we have found the automobile to be impracticable and will not pursue this adventure any farther. A little bit wrong on that. So here is a 1932 Ford Hot Rod. You can see what we do for color management. This is something we're still working on. Again, going back to what's difficult about photographing automobiles. It's the shiny reflective surface. The paint, you have these crazy paint types that will have clear coat. They'll have different color hues based on the color cast in the room, based on what's reflecting into them. It can be very difficult to represent the colors accurately. You can see these shots we actually had, so just as far as like putting the cars in, most major photographic studios paint the floor once or twice, a month, or every time they bring a car in. I'm one guy, I couldn't roll a car in, photograph it, roll the car back out, repaint the floor. It just wasn't happening. So, we were in a facility adjacent to a restoration shop. They use epoxy floors, so we said, okay, well, we need it flat so we can control light. The flattest they could get the epoxy is what you're seeing here. Obviously, it's not that flat. It's still shiny, it's reflecting light everywhere. And what ended up happening is the epoxy wasn't that durable. It still stained, oils, because you think about it, all these old cars, they all leak, no matter how well they were restored. That's not even to talk about the unrestored cars. The tires have carbon in them. They stain the floor. They stain paint. They stain epoxy. And we just had the floor refinished because that first floor was just terrible. So you can see in this photo, no reflection. I actually have a nice little shadow, a little bit of contrast in there. But even this floor, we went to urethane. It's much flatter, but it's still staining. Not exactly sure what the answer is besides just refinishing it. But it's such a massive space. We're looking at around $6,000 to $7,000 every time we refinish the floor. So then into detail. So we do the overall shots using the turntable, spin the car around from one location. Then we go into details. Again, longer focal length, macro lenses, tilt shifts, trying to make sure that there's limited distortion, that we're representing the car as it is. Obviously, this can be very difficult. A really informative photo is sitting in the back seat and photographing the dash. You're going to have to use a wide-angle lens and deal with distortion that way. Perspective correction, some of this is based on standards that we're trying to work towards for HABs and hair. So using perspective correction in camera as much as possible. Again, macro lenses, neutral lighting. We use Profoto strobes, but introduce some sort of contrast, use color targets, trying to manage colors. Just some examples of some details on that Benton Harbor and the hot rod. So what do we do for processing? So since we've been kind of working outside of the rules here, the basic understanding was the photos that I was capturing were being converted to TIFFs, sent to Albumin Works to be converted to film with basically no processing. So the way the workflow was go into Lightroom, export to a TIFF as natively as possible, and send that in. Because since we weren't necessarily supposed to be shooting on digital, it had to be as close to what we would be getting from a view camera as possible. Since last week we started developing these digital standards, this is going to change. There's some more leeway here. So basic adjustments that we'll be doing, global tone adjustments, contrast here and there, no cloning. And the way it's going to work is we're going to go into a DNG, and that DNG will be submitted to the Library of Congress, where it'll be archived. And that way, if I go in and bring out the shadows, bring down the highlights a little bit, people will be able to download that DNG from the Library of Congress's website and see what's been done to the image. So it's all recorded and it's all as transparent as possible. With the help of Erik, I started doing, as I've always been concerned about color. We've been using the color checker charts, analyzing those through delt.ae to give some sort of idea of how accurate we are. And I would like to adopt the golden thread software and system to try and help this along. There's still some issues though, because those color targets provide a reference point, but they're matte finishes. They're maybe not representing how the colors are appearing on the automobiles. So there's a lot of those sort of issues to deal with. And then, I've just looked out there what has been done for managing color and been reading a lot about the FADGI standards and trying to apply those to our workflow. And then, as I mentioned, going from raw to DNG, and that's what we're going to submit so that the public will see the DNG file and understand exactly how the images were captured as much as possible. And then I'm not going to say too much about this because at the moment, other than the files that I submit in, I'm the only one managing the files, so it's basically just in folders. I'd love to go to a DAM eventually because we're building out our staff. And then obviously redundancy. And then I mentioned how we had been going from digital to film. Although we're going to stop doing this, I still kind of toy with the idea that for our collection, we would like to probably still do 1 or 2 images onto film just because of the archival permanency that we know that has. And then I believe the new requirements will include a print. So we'll be doing that based on those standards. And then, where have we based our research on this? What has been sort of the baseline? It's the FADGI guidelines, the AIC guide, and then also the Heritage Documentation's guidelines for how we document. And that's kind of been what we've based our workflow on. Again, mainly being over in the Heritage Documentation programs because that is kind of our end result is that collection in the Library of Congress. So,
Super. Thank you, Casey. That's great. That's great. That's fabulous. So we have time for a couple questions, I think. Yeah, we have plenty of time for questions. Anything that we can clarify for you? Kurt, I know you're dying to ask a question about color management.
No,
I just know that.
Actually, it's not color management. It's actually what kind of other, besides just imaging and creating line drawings and so forth, we talked about recording audio and other things. Are you documenting any original drawings from the manufacturers? Are you paint formulations, those kinds of things?
So that goes into those sort of documents go into the history report that is then archived at the Library of Congress. Part of the issue with that is copyright. So when it goes to the Library of Congress, it has to be copyright free. So I am compiling as much of that data as I can to include in the report, and as much of those photos or, like you said, like paint chips and that sort of thing, like I'll scan those in and try and include those. But again, it's about getting a sort of copyright to at least make that available to the public. If I'm not able to scan that, I will at least reference it. Recognize, like on the 1967 Camaro, I'm trying to remember, it's like a camel color. I can't remember, but I would reference the exact color that GM used and where that information came from. The historic report is well cited, and it offers exactly the archives and where everything came from so that future researchers will be able to understand all of that.
Any other questions?
You do want to go to color.
Well, I'll go to color management. One of the people that I'd hoped to have on the panel that I wasn't because of schedules and because there are so few experts in the field, was not able to include would have been a color scientist who dealt specifically with issues of interference color, paints that have embedded metal flakes, this sort of thing, colors that change dependent on the angle of light. And there are people doing that kind of research in terms of how to document those colors. Generally, that research is centered around the Munsell Color Lab at Rochester Institute of Technology. So if you have interest in that, that would be a place to look, and those would be, I'm not sure who's, Kurt, do you know exactly who's doing that work at RIT? It's not Roy Behrens, but
It's not Roy, it's not Susan Farnan, I forget.
yeah, I'm not sure, but if you were interested in following up on that, because it's a daunting problem, and also it's not just automobiles that use that kind of paint. Even Donald Judd sculptures use that kind of paint, right? But contacting the Munsell Color Lab at RIT would be a way to get more information from that.
But also, one other problem in the color science field right now is the company X-Ray has been buying, like, basically all the great postdocs and graduate students out there. They've been like sucking up the brain drain in color. So like outside of Munsell Lab, they've all disappeared. They're like really good ones at Carnegie Mellon and such. But X-Ray's been doing a lot of interesting things, particularly in this kind of color management field around paints for cars and things like that. They have this one insane color measurement scanner device, and it'll take a sample up to a 30 by 20 centimeter sample, and it will take 10, 15, 20 minutes to do a measurement, but it will give you not just the color, but like the spatially variable bidirectional reflectance. So you get the gloss, you get if there's any transmission, and you basically from like one sample you get like 20 gigabytes of data.
Oh, that'd be incredible.
But they have the device, but they also do it as a service. And it might be something that, like, if you were to even just talk to them and say, well, I have these paint samples or a part of a car, just see what you can do with it. Maybe they might be interested in using it as a use case.
Okay.
Yeah, they might be. And do you know if that's a non-contact process?
As far as I know, it's a non-contact. It's multiple angles of light.
Yeah,
from any
that's what I would
camera
think.
Inside this closed device, it kind of goes into the box. You close it, and there's tons of light.
But you have to put a sample into
It
the
has
box.
to be, yeah, it's a
Okay.
sample. You're not going to put it to a car. So
Oh,
you
you're
have
not.
to-
Okay.
But if you can remove a small enough
Okay.
portion, or if you have those paint samples, because as we know, you have that paint sample, it's glossy, you scan it, you can't see the gloss
Yeah.
anymore, so.
Any other questions? Anybody got an old Oldsmobile from 1956 out in the barn? You know, just take a second look. Yeah.
I guess that'd be a question. What's the scope of your mission, like in terms of dates, in terms of historical relevance? Like, will you be taking the 2007 Toyota Prius
Yes.
when it becomes relevant?
It's relevant already. So one of the nice things about the Historic American Engineering record, I mean, there's the lens of time is important. However, unlike the National Register of Historic Places, there is not a 50-year requirement. So we're looking at things from the 1896 Benton Harbor to the 1984 minivan. Changed the industry. It changed how society, I mean, it created a soccer mom generation. We're looking at absolutely the Google car and how that's going to change things. It's important to document heritage now before we've lost people. You guys may be familiar with the Shelby Cobra. Well, we documented a Daytona Cobra Coupe, one of his race cars, but we had lost him the year before. We lost the engineer of that car the year before we got to it. So we want to document these cars as soon as possible so that we have the primary source data as available as possible. But we also need to be mindful of, maybe something will happen tomorrow and the Google car won't be relevant at all. So the Prius absolutely is relevant, and it just kind of depends on finding the car to document. So we had a lot of criticism for the past 2 or 3 years because we haven't done a Model T yet. Well, I always say back to somebody, point me to a Model T that we should do, because what we are about is documenting one specific car. And the first Model T doesn't exist. And it's while everybody can recognize that the Model T was important, it's hard for most people, and including myself that has spent the past 4 years looking for an important Model T, to say, okay, what Model T to begin with will represent all of the Model Ts. So it's more about that than it is about a year sort of requirement.
I think that's really interesting to recognize what you're driving now and whether it might be significant in the future. I think so. More hands. Deb?
How deeply are you documenting the internal components? I mean, how the engine works, how the engine is constructed?
It is all dependent upon what has made that vehicle significant. So what I didn't mention is we have 4 criteria for significance. They're the same criteria used for the National Register of Historic Places. It's importance, association with important event, association with important person, design or construction value, or information value. Information value being that it might provide, documenting it now might provide some sort of information to future generations, whether that's the last remaining example, et cetera. So if the most important feature of a certain automobile was its engine, we would document as much as we can its engine while being mindful of conservation. So, you know, if it's an unrestored vehicle, to take apart the engine would probably be impractical, especially if, you know, and then we also have to deal, all of these are either privately owned or owned by museums. So we also work with them how comfortable they are as the owners to let us take apart things or photograph or scan. But we haven't, we are more interested in culturally significant stuff at the moment than necessarily just design or engineering. So we haven't really got into anything that's just so spectacular for its engineering features. But when we do, like we would like to do exploded diagrams and work with the folks over at Heritage Documentations to do some of those sort of drawings that will represent the mechanical features.
I saw more hands, person in the front.
So I was going to ask, I work at a car museum, so like, how does this affect me? Or, so you're sort of doing the research and choosing the cars?
Yeah. So for now, we're doing the research, choosing the cars. We do about 5 a year, with the idea being that we want to make sure that before this program is launched to everybody, that we have sort of we've shown that it's about the wide gamut, you know, and it's about things that are culturally important, not just, I have the only 1972 Olds with air conditioning, brown seats, and a yellow exterior, and this engine combination, because we get a lot of that from the automotive community. I mean, I get emails all the time saying, you know, my car is the only one with roll-up windows instead of electric windows. It's very significant. So we want to make sure that we've shown kind of the wide scope of how the automobile has impacted American life. So,
Wayne?
So I was curious as to, are you just limited to four-wheel vehicles? Do you have any anticipation of motorcycles or trucks or any other wheeled vehicle?
absolutely. We actually did an 8-wheeled vehicle. 8-wheeled vehicle. No, we plan to do trucks, motorcycles, everything. We're kind of focusing on automobiles to begin with. I'm a motorcyclist, so I'm pushing really hard to do motorcycles, but I'm also trying to be mindful of not putting my own sort of spin on it. So in the U.S., automobiles have had a much greater impact for the most part, so we want to make sure we get things like a Model T before we get into other aspects of the world. But obviously trucks have, I mean, one thing we also try to be careful of is, while things that are nationally significant seem to kind of float to the top, in your local or state communities, like the local milk truck might have been just as significant to everyday life as, say a 1967 Camaro. So we want to make sure we get some of that. One thing a lot of people don't know is, while there are only 3 car manufacturers, or 3 major American car manufacturers right now, at one point there have been over like 2,500. So every state you go to, every small community there was a car manufacturer. And so we want to start documenting, or we have started documenting some of those, because they were really important in the local region. So to answer your question, absolutely everything.
Yeah.
Question for Jarob. With the NPS move towards digital, do you still plan to use view camera style cameras in the field with digital medium format backs, or are you going to switch to a DSLR style with perspective control lenses?
Personally, my preference is that we are going to stick with view cameras with medium format back, and the main reason for that is because we are talking about true 16-bit color as opposed to interpolated 16-bit color, and I've been working with these things since I was in school, and I can tell the difference between a lower megapixel digital back and a file that's produced by a higher megapixel DSLR camera. It's just a better file. It gives you more information. That's where we want to go, but we are going to allow DSLR formats into the collection, but they have to meet certain criteria to be a part of what it is that we're going to accept. So, yeah, we're going to be sticking with the view camera.
So on the color accuracy side, that's where FADG can come in, Golden Thread, Del.AE, right? So it's like, yes, it may have been made with a 50 megapixel Canon, but if it passes these specs with whatever Delta E you've designated, you know what you've got at least, right? Even though that camera may, say, be more restricted in its bit depth, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Were there any other questions? Oh, yeah, another question, Ben, yeah.
That we brought up at lunch really quick for Casey, concerning newer vehicles that have been created and modeled in the age of computer animation, et cetera. Do you see a place in the preservation of these for the CAD drawings of these vehicles, the animations that exist for internal components, et cetera?
Absolutely. Again, I mean, it's something that we would personally want to archive, but a lot of it's proprietary data. A lot of it is just getting a manufacturer to turn that over. I mean,
They would have to effectively put it into the public domain.
yeah, for it to go to the Library of Congress, it has to be totally rights-free. I mean, I fight with the manufacturers over a sales brochure from 1932. So something that they released to the public as much as they possibly could. But it comes down to the fact that, look, you know, their archivist isn't necessarily in a position to sign any sort of legal release on something like that, and it's not something they encounter on a daily basis, and it's not like their chief legal officer is even going to take the time to look at it anyway. So, I mean, yes, we would love to document that and put as much of that out there as we can, but it's a matter of actually getting somebody to hand it over.
I think it's interesting, too. It's just occurring to me that you can sort of turn this whole process around in that, as I think as many people know, or most people know, that so much of the advertising you see of automobiles is itself not a photograph of an automobile, but instead it's a three-dimensional rendering that's what we're looking at. So we're talking about three-dimensional renderings being used to replicate the look of an automobile, and we're also talking about taking an automobile and creating three-dimensional renderings it's this continuous circle, you know, the snake's biting its tail, you know? Were there any other questions? And if not, I just want to thank everyone for hanging in until the end. I hope that we made this worthwhile, even if you miss your plane going home. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.